Pablo Damasceno. I'm a data scientist at UCSF. And I'll switch gears a little bit from talking particularly about images, but I will be talking to you guys almost like an outsider perspective on what can happen to your data once you have already pre-processed the data and done all this amazing work with the data you have, and methods of data science that you can use to just extract the last drop of accuracy for your model once you already have done this work with your data. So we have learned a lot of very interesting methods for registering, filtering, masking your data, segmenting. And once you get this data already in a CSV format, or if you're more environmentally friendly, a pandas data frame, what can you do to this data to extract the kind of information you're interested in? In this case here, I have patients on the rows, and in the columns here, I have amounts of tau accumulation in brain regions of patients with Alzheimer's. And in this case, the task that we are interested in is perhaps look at this data and classify whether a particular patient is Alzheimer's or cognitively normal patient. And luckily, if you are just into image processing and you've done all this hard work, by the time you get to this point with a CSV file, and if you're not familiar with other data science methods, there are lots of very nice tutorials out there. Particularly, I suggest the tutorials from Gael's group, from the book from Andreas, and lots of, just to read the documentation as well, scikit-learn, scikit-image, Napari we learned about today a lot. And you start from your simple methods, right? A linear regression, and you go down to more complex methods like a random forest, a support vector machine, a neural network. But what if you just fed your machine learning algorithm with your data and you're not getting the results that you expected? What if you're just not there yet? Well, you can, basically if you take one lesson from this talk is that you should not get desperate, and that there are methods of playing with your data in such a way that you might acquire more information than initially it seemed to be there, which particularly this is so-called feature engineering. So I'm going to talk about 3 examples from my own work, and I'm going to be very superficial just because of the time that I have, but I'll be around, and I'll be happy if any of you guys stopped by. We can talk about those particular examples in detail. And as I mentioned, I do not do any of the acquisition of the images. I do not do any pre-processing of the images. So I have a lot to thank to a large number of collaborators that actually acquired this data and pre-processed all of this in order for me to just be able to work with a CSV file. In particular, Gil Rabinovici, who's here at Berkeley and also at the Memory Aging Center at UCSF. And the first work that I will be talking to you guys about was the data from Gil Rabinovici's lab and Renaud Lajoie, who brought data from 85 Alzheimer's patients that they had at the MEC. And about half of these patients, they have the so-called typical Alzheimer's disease, where you have loss in memory, traditionally the typical type of memory that Alzheimer's can affect. But about a fourth of these patients had memory impairment in the visual cortex. So basically, you are forgetful only about images. And another group of patients, they were forgetful particularly of words and sentences and things like that. And this is the so-called language variant of Alzheimer's. If you just plot the data and you look at it, it's really hard to see the difference between those patients just looking at, for instance, where the atrophy is. It's very subtle. But the whole idea here is whether a machine learning can detect those differences. And the question that they are interested in is, can a machine learning look at data, for instance, the atrophy pattern in those brains, or the accumulation of amyloid beta, or the accumulation of tau in different regions of the brain? Can a method tell me which class those patients belong to? Because this can give us some intuition on what might be happening in their brain. So here is what anyone would start doing. You go over the minimal, the simple examples that you can try, a linear regression. I have examples here following a spectral clustering algorithm, a random forest, and 2 different versions of an SVM method. And what I'm showing here on the x-axis is that if you only use the amyloid beta pattern in the brain of these patients, you have some accuracy. Usually, for all the cases, if you use the atrophy pattern as opposed to the amyloid beta accumulation, your accuracy increases. And for the SVM model, if you used only the tau pattern accumulation, you get an even better increase in accuracy. Values are reported for a test set, independent of the training set. But the first message here is that tau, which is something that has been only recently, this data has been gathered about those patients, is that the measuring tau is indeed something that gives us more information than just measuring atrophy. And this, if just we stopped here, this will be a result that is publishable, is a new result. But as a data scientist, you can go take a step ahead and go beyond this and start maybe playing with these variables. What if I, for instance, sum some of these variables, or what if I multiply some of them? And I'm not going to show all the different variants I did out of this, but it turns out that if you multiply the atrophy pattern in the brain, it's just a matrix, right? With rows are the patients, the columns are the different regions of the brain that have different atrophies, and you multiply by the pattern of tau accumulation, you get an increase in the accuracy of splitting those patients into their particular classes. And so does it make sense? Then you take a step back and say, okay, this from a purely data-driven point of view, this multiplication seems to work, but why would that work? And that's where, as a data scientist, I go to my collaborators, like Mariana and people who understand actually stuff about the disease that we are working on. And the reasoning brought up by our collaborator, Renaud, was that, well, we know that atrophy in the brain can be caused by all sorts of things. It can be caused by, for instance, just aging, and this is not Alzheimer's. Another thing we know is that usually tau accumulation will cause atrophy in the region of the brain, and this atrophy is going to cause the cognitive decline. So when you're multiplying those two, you're working as an AND gate. I have tau, and I have atrophy, so there's a good chance that the atrophy in this region is being caused by the tau. And just having tau also doesn't mean anything at this moment, because if it has not caused atrophy yet, you don't have the cognitive decline. So then it made sense that the multiplication worked. And this whole story becomes a lot more interesting, because then you have a reasoning on what is going on. So the first lesson here is that sometimes creating new features out of the old ones that you started with can give you more information. The second example I have is from a somewhat old paper. The first version of this paper was around 2010, and a revised version in 2013 from some people, including Jagus, who is here at Berkeley. And what they're showing here is that if you could take a patient and follow this patient with Alzheimer's longitudinally over time, you would see an increase in accumulation of, let's say, the proteins, the amyloid beta protein or the tau protein, that would show up before you would be able to measure the atrophy, which is the atrophy would be the dark blue curve, the fourth curve if you go from left to right. And only then you start seeing the cognitive decline. So they predicted this sequence, this cascading effect of you first see amyloid accumulating, then you're going to see tau accumulating. This is going to cause the atrophy, and the atrophy is going to cause the cognitive decline. The hard thing about trying to check with this theory, this prediction is true, is that there is very little longitudinal data. There is not enough patients that have been followed over a decade of time, for instance, where they started measuring tau. This is a very new technique that people have only been measuring in the last 5 years or so. So what if we could take a bunch of patients that have been accumulated in a data set cross-sectionally, and we can try to predict or try to somehow create a longitudinal axis. This is our prediction here would be somehow try to predict how this patient is going to evolve in time. But this was a problem that I could not really tackle, but I could maybe construct a different problem, which is not exactly this problem, but which is, can I take a cross-sectional data of patients and try to predict a number, which is, I'm calling a disease severity. It's just a number that goes from 0 to 1, which is 0, you're perfectly healthy. If you 1, you are in the end of the spectrum of the disease. And this can be done, this is, from the data science point of view, this is nothing else than you're taking a 100-dimensional space and you're trying to create a 1-dimensional manifold that corresponds to this 100-dimensional space, where patients that are very similar to each other in this 100-dimensional space are also going to be very similar to each other, very close by in 1-dimensional space. So here I'm showing 3 projections of a 3-dimensional manifold, which is basically an unfolding of a 1-dimensional manifold, where the dots here are different patients from the EDNI, the Open Data Science of Alzheimer's Disease. It's a cross-sectional data set with each of those dots is a patient. And basically what I'm doing is that I'm taking every information, all the information we have about those patients, and I'm condensing them into this one-dimensional manifold. And in the far left, you have healthy patients, and as you go further and further to the left, you have AKA more and more healthy, and to the right, more and more Alzheimer's-like. And what I'm showing here in the bottom is that if you just color them by the diagnosis that they are given, healthy are blue, mildly cognitively impaired in the middle, and Alzheimer's, you're actually making the sequence of disease severity. And then once now we have this new axis that you started from purely cross-sectional data and transform into a longitudinal data, you can measure things like these curves, and the sequence actually matches the predictions. You start with amyloid beta, then tau, then you get atrophy in the brain, then the cognitive scores start to show up. So the prediction is valid there. And finally, just going to give a very quick example of a third work that we have done with now longitudinal data. Eli Lilly is a pharmaceutical company. They came to us with data from Alzheimer's patients, 35 Alzheimer's patients, some mildly cognitively impaired and some normal patients, that they followed over 18 months. And the question they had was, can you predict how much tau is going to accumulate in the brain of this patient over a period of 18 months? So take the data from baseline, try to predict 18 months. The reason why they want to do that is that if they are able to create a drug, they want to say, the prediction said they were going to increase 20 whatever percent, we increased by 4%, so our drug is working. So the question here is, can you predict longitudinally what's happening? Due to lack of time, I'm not going to show you all the details, but when I tried to predict all the regions of the brain, how much tau is going to accumulate, the results were embarrassing. Nothing really worked really well. So what we tried to do then was, what if we decrease the problem? What if instead of trying to predict the amount of tau protein in every region of the brain, what if we're just shooting for one number? What if we're trying, for instance, to predict the sum of tau protein in the whole brain? And with that, we had a little more success. Here I'm showing just the test and training accuracies, or the R-squared, as a function of the penalty that we use for SVM model. And since this worked well, another thing that we tried after that was, what if instead of summing the amount of protein in the whole brain, what if we only look at a subset of regions that we know that the tau protein is usually going from the subcortical regions to the cortical regions? What if we just sum the frontal regions that we know is where the protein is eventually moving to? And that increased the accuracy even more. And finally, what if we just use the 2 or 3 regions, the finer regions that we know the protein is moving for from the previous model? Because before, as I mentioned, we had transformed a cross-sectional data set into a longitudinal data set. And from that, we could see where the protein was moving to. And then using this completely separate data set and say, can you predict the amount of protein that is going to move, this patient is going to have in 18 months, just in these final regions that we know it's the end point, and the accuracy increased even more. So the point of this third example is that selecting the features, sometimes your problem was when I started, right? The idea was to try to predict protein movement in all the regions of the brain. But if you select your features and you say, I'm only going to predict the sum or in a subset of regions, this can, again, increase your accuracy. But if you're going to take one take-home message from this talk, it's basically do not panic. When you finish your data analysis and you have your everything into a CSV, there are lots of great tutorials there you can use to learn what to do with your data. If that didn't work, well, don't panic again, because you can now, okay, this was the basic features. What if I start modifying my features? What if I start combining all my dimensions into one dimension? Or what if I start to just look at a subset of those dimensions? And this might work as well. If that doesn't work, maybe that's time to panic, but that's when, collaborating, talking to other data scientists really can help you out. So thank you, guys, and I'll take any questions.
The regular number, a number that is acceptable in terms of what's your population? How many patients do you need to analyze?
Yeah, how many patients do I need to? Like usually people come to us with very large data sets that are like 50 patients. And that is where the tricky part comes. So mainly for the tau protein that people have only been measuring the past 5 years or so, it's very hard to get anything larger than 50 to like 100 patients. So this is really, it's tricky. But luckily, if you're looking at one cohort of, let's say, just Alzheimer's patients without talking about those other variants, they are homogeneous in a sense. But yeah, the numbers are the dozens, so that's hard.
Okay, and how long? Because you also have temporal information.
Yes, again, for tau, the maximum that people have so far is 18 months, which we have not seen any indication that this is enough for any of the protein to move around. It seems that this is enough for protein. The protein increases locally, but doesn't seem to diffuse very much in 18 months. We would like if you're measuring atrophy, which is just how much regions shrink, then there are data sets with like 10 years longitudinal studies of atrophy, but not of what is causing the atrophy. So
And
it's.
then another, more like a curiosity, prodromal. Can you actually, in any of your studies, tell a little bit